Our next speaker is Dr. Lyla O'Connor. I'm very pleased to have her here, and she is Senior Partner and Executive Director of IIPSM, International Institute of Sustainability and Project Management. IIPSM was conceived in 2010 to address the need of organizations to incorporate sustainability into their everyday business practices. Dr. O'Connor is the founder of Metamorphosis Change Management, a consultancy that provides best practices in developing change and project management strategies. Lyla is the correct pronunciation, this, just so that everybody knows, and I realize that, has over 15 years of international change management experience with commitment to development of sustainable solutions. Working with the United Nations Development Program, Lyla has provided disaster management services for government and communities in Africa, Central and South America, helping in the sustainable development of new infrastructure for primary health care and education. She's also worked with the Council of Yukon First Nation and conducted situational analysis, environmental scans, and helped the community. Please welcome Lyla, and she will talk about develop your own model for success of change.
Can everyone hear me okay? I sound really loud in my own head, so I'm not sure how loud I sound outside.
It's very loud.
Yes? Okay. I want to give you just a brief background into me so that you understand where it is that I'm coming from. By education, I'm a biologist. My doctorate degree was in genetics. And the segue into the United Nations led me into disaster management, dealing specifically with first-line emergency and quarantine procedures, developing change management strategies at a it was like change management on steroids. It was something that the disaster was at hand, and we had to figure out a strategy so that by next week there was a new system in place in order to address the situation, so that a month from then we would not have a secondary or tertiary outbreak from the initial disaster. So this is how I sort of segued from genetics into change management. And I joined the IIPSM because I love their idea in developing the world's biggest sustainability community of practice. And part of it was addressing what Asad was talking about, is that there is a time that is coming, especially in the consultative services, where we cannot be hoarding the information. It just isn't going to be possible, not with all the social media and all of the information sharing that is already going on in every other place. And so if we can bring the greatest minds and the people already working in some of these fields together, we're hoping to be able to develop that kind of community of practice within the sustainability space. So just so that we all start out with the understanding of where we're going here, I just want to set some ground rules of what it is that I mean when I say sustainability. When I work with clients, probably the first week I spend sort of working against the grain to get away from the idea that sustainability means environmentalism. It isn't what we are aiming to do. Certainly, environment is one of the aspects or one of the components of what we define as sustainability, but it isn't the same thing as sustainability. And so what we've developed is this Beck model, the idea being that if we deal with business and we deal with the environment and we incorporate community, at the intersection of these three subsets is where we get sustainability. Without all three components working simultaneously, we can't have that sustainability. And the easiest example I can give you is that if you don't know how you're going to feed your children tomorrow, you don't really care that people are cutting down the rainforest. You just don't. It isn't, you're never going to sell that idea to anyone who is struggling at that moment. And in as much as we are talking nowadays, and I've had immense intellectual arguments both online and at conferences about how profits are evil, it's a hard sell to make to people who come from countries where for the first time they are making profits and they are seeing the differences that it's making in their communities and in their own lives. And so the idea is not to cut out the economic development out of the picture or to cut out the community. And certainly we have to address the environment, because if we have nowhere to conduct the business or to live in, we're not going to go very far anyway. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to be going through 4 principles and practices on how to develop, the strategy or that theory of change. And the first thing is you need to develop your theory of success. You have to know ahead of time, and it's sadly when I get called in and organizations call me in, they say we need to develop, our change strategy, and I ask them, okay, so let's sit down, and I realize they're already halfway into their project, or they're a few weeks short of the go live date. And my thought is, now you want to develop the change strategy. So before you even start, you need to understand what is your own theory of success. What is success going to look like, so that you recognize it when you get there. And so the biggest problem with change efforts, whenever they are launched, they often can plateau early or peak too soon, and that leads to failure, because you get your biggest moment of success at a time far too soon before the actual launch of the actual initiative. And so a big problem with it is, and going back to the understanding that I am a biologist, is that these systems work both at the organic and at the corporate and communities and governmental levels, is that most organizations don't really understand how the social structure or the environment of their own community works. And this is true at the corporate level, at government, and even within communities. How is it that, what is the environment, what is the corporate culture that you're working within? What is it that your employees or your workers or even your administrative or even a high-level staff really think of when they think of this machine moving forward? And the second thing is that most organizations, and this is true of us as human beings in general, we focus so much on reducing the non-sustainability components and focusing on the negative aspect, rather than focusing on those things that are actually going to improve sustainability. So we're so focused on reducing the carbon footprint, or getting our green effort up, rather than saying, how are we going to develop systems that are going to prevent us from even having to ask those questions in the future. And so rather than focusing on the reduction of that sustainability, let's figure out how we're going to build on it. So the biggest thing is that we want to develop that definition of success. What is it that we are trying to achieve? What is it that is going to make us see ourselves as a successful venture when we're finished with the whole process? Certainly, there's always the triple bottom lines, and the idea of getting ourselves a little more green and being able to meet the demands of the criteria for a sustainable reporting. But what is it that we are truly trying to achieve in launching an initiative like this? Because it's certainly no small effort once you actually initiate a change strategy. And how are we going to know that we've arrived? How will we know that we are successful if we don't know what that success looks like? And so that definition needs to be, and it needs to be done from the ground up. It's a terrible thing when you get the high-level players. They all come together, they're all really clear on the picture that they want to do, and off they go and launch date, except that they've forgotten to tell the people who are actually going to be carrying the initiative on their backs what that initiative is going to look like. Please, if anybody has any questions along the way, feel free to interrupt at any time. Okay. So how does change happen? How do we actually, well, the first thing that we need to do is understand that it never happens by accident. Most people always say, change is inevitable, like death and taxes. And what I always tell people is it's not inevitable, it's constant. From the minute you get up in the morning to the time you go to bed, you're not the same person that got up that morning. Our cellular structures are changing constantly, our environments are changing constantly, our communities, the organizations we work with. So it isn't something that is inevitable that we have to dread, it's something that we need to embrace because it happens continuously. So we want to get the idea of how do we then embrace this change that is going to happen continuously, and how do we sort of take hold of the reins so that we're not being taken for a ride and we're actually steering the car along the way. And this comes back to the idea of going through the positive rather than the negative reinforcements. So we want to have this self-reinforcing feedback, the idea of understanding and developing the driving forces behind change, rather than just focusing on the change resistors, let's focus on the change drivers. What is it that is going to make this a reality? And I don't want anybody to get confused with the B and the R and the diagrams that come up. The idea of the R being reinforcing and B being balancing, it comes back again to biology. In the nature of things, in the natural system, everything, when it gets off balance, it pushes itself so that it can regain that balance. And that's the balancing effect. But the balancing effect doesn't allow for a change because it fights to come back to where it started at. And so those balancing, the balancing effects that we have in change strategies are the ones that you want to try and maneuver and force into a reinforcing feedback so that you can actually make that leap into that next system and actually create a change. You want to prevent that balancing process from happening. So this is where we've got the idea. If you get this, the sense of a reinforcing pattern, you start with the idea that there has to be a willingness to change, a willingness to see that something is going to happen, that it's going to be for the better, that it is going to be far more effective, and it's going to be beneficial. And that is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because what happens is people are willing and they take in the idea of a new approach. And when that approach is instituted, then there's an increased commitment when they start to see that things are actually working, and that works as well right back into the idea of willingness to try a new approach. Because the last time we tried something new, it worked really well, so now let's go back and try something new again. Whenever you have that process, it's a positive, self-reinforcing philosophy. But this is the balancing process, and this is what we get when we have that resistance to change. So the diagram on the left that you'll see is the balancing effect. That's when organizations, individuals in organizations, or communities in general, are pushing or fighting the system to come back to that original status. And so usually it has to do with fear. Fear feeds our most basic reactions to anything. A fear of losing control, a fear of losing jobs, a fear of losing status, a fear of losing understanding because it's a new system, how am I going to function? And when there is that fear, right away there's that resistance to a new approach. Let's not change it if it's already working. I've worked in organizations, people have actually up and quit, not even been fired, they've actually quit before having to deal with this new process because it becomes overwhelming. And then what happens is that it goes right back in that balancing process. So what we want to interject in there, and that's the arrow at the top, is that this is where we want to interject those positive reinforcements to show what the benefits are going to be for this change. How is this change going to actually benefit what we are already doing? And that is where it leads you into that successful new approach, and you go into that self-reinforcing wheel, and it comes back, and that willingness to expand and try new approaches pushes back into that balancing, and there is a change in thinking. People actually begin to think, you know what, if the change wasn't so bad the first time, it may not be so bad the next time. And change starts to become a part of the culture as opposed to something that kind of gets enforced into them. So what does this mean for sustainability change management? Somebody once told me that it's like an oxymoron. How do you get sustainability and change into the same sentence? And it's a tough definition because you're right, sustainability, usually we think about things being kept the same, sustaining the same thing, and change obviously means evolving. But the idea of sustainability, when we address it, and we address it both at the micro and at the macro levels, because sustainability, which is why we want to get away from the idea of thinking it as environmentalism, is the kind of process that once it takes off, it is self-propelling, and so that it can contain itself in a process without the consultants or the organizations that came in having to sort of take up permanent residence in the organization. And so if there is a partnership between two organizations or governments or communities, there has to be a way for any system that gets incorporated to be able to be self-propelling. And that's the idea of sustainability in change. So that's the first thing we always say. when there is going to be a new strategy implemented or we're going to move towards a new system, we can't hope that it happens by accident. It requires purpose of thought, it requires real commitment, there has to be an intention where there is an actual thought process that says, this is what we are going to do and this is how we're going to do it differently. And there needs to be clarity. And this is where the breakdown usually happens, is that we've got a unidirectional system of communication where their powers that be usually arrive at that decision and then everything is set. I wrote an article saying you can't change a company by now. It's a horrible system and yet we do it all the time. The decision gets made, the memos get sent out, this is how we're going to do it, and then you get everybody panicking as it trickles on down. So the clarity needs to be addressed with respect to, first and foremost, the goals. Once we know what those goals are going to be and we know what they're going to look like, then our theory of success can start to take shape. The second thing, and this is vital because we are still at the point where, in as much as we are fighting it and the robotics are taking over, people are a big integral part of anything that we do. Roles have to be clearly defined. What is it that you expect me to do? What can I expect of you once this process starts? And how is this going to be, something that we can actually work out on a regular basis? And the third thing is the rules have to be clear. The game has to be established right from the get-go. If we're not clear on what the rules are going to be, this is when stress levels go up, and from an HR perspective, it becomes a nightmare. When stress levels and burnout happens, then you have a whole other set of problems in any change strategy. So goals, the roles, and the rules. So clarity of goals means there's the purpose and the goals for the strategies and tactics are carefully outlined so that everyone is clear what they are, and before we can move forward, there has to be some kind of an agreement or commitment that, yes, I agree, this is what we are going to go for, and this is my commitment to actually make this a success. Without that embracement, and we talk about stakeholders all the time, often people will refer to stakeholders as the people out there, outside of the organization, but we really have to be careful to understand that your biggest stakeholders, and probably your most important, are your own staff. They are your greatest resource, and if they have not embraced and they are not fully on board, this is never going to take off. Clarity for roles requires that everyone knows what their function is going to be. It's also important for them to know how important their function is in the whole process, to understand that everyone is a vital part of the process in arriving at that final stage. And the rules are important. Decision-making, information, resources, how this is communicated at every stage of the process and to every level throughout the organization. Without that clarity of communication and the rules being fully understood, if we don't know how to agreement before we start, again, throughout the process, there's going to be the stumbling blocks, and you get those change resistors that pop up in the middle of a process. So, how do we apply this to systems thinking? And system thinking, it comes from understanding something from within, working your way outwards. Understanding how that environment of the culture that you're sitting in actually applies. Because a lot of my background is dealing with indigenous cultures, both abroad and in Canada, a big part of the idea of cultural safety becomes a big part of any change initiative that gets instituted. So my role in the process is developing a strategy that encompasses that so that the people who are going to be undergoing that change understand. We're not going to come out the other end looking like something completely different, where we've lost our identity, our integrity, and our cultural safety has been completely disregarded. So,
would you like to give some examples of sustainable changes projects that
sure. So one of the biggest things that one of the biggest projects probably that we've done in the past was actually right here in Canada. We went to the Council of Yukon First Nations. They are a governing body that represents the 14 First Nations in the Yukon. And there has been a big push for services in primary health care within the First Nations in the Yukon. They are self-governing out of the 14, 11 of them are self-governing, and so they actually put forth their own policy, and they have their own funding, and they perpetuate their own processes. The problem was becoming is that as they were rolling out many of these programs, especially for primary health care, the gap for services was widening. And what they were finding is that healthcare services that were being provided to First Nations were lagging a good decade, sometimes two, in services and quality of care. So their big push was, how do we move ourselves forward? But again, the big question was, how do we move forward without losing our history and our past? Well, what had happened was that they had consultants that had come in and had been in the process of establishing the strategy for over 10 years. And what their objective was, how do we actually get the help that we need from the white people, because we understand we don't have the knowledge, but at some point, how do we take ownership? And that is where the sustainability change comes in, is actually transferring, or that transition process from consultancy into ownership for the client. And so the sustainability processes that we actually implemented had to do with mentorship, accreditation and certification, which is a big issue for the First Nations people, because many of them don't have the formal education, and without it, can't get recognition for getting accreditation. Big problem with it was for the social workers and the services that they offered, they could not get, they couldn't get any support from the Canadian Association for Social Workers, because that association didn't recognize their work as social work. There are many standards that have to be met in social work, one of which they cannot be in first or second degree of contact with the clients. Unfortunately, when you come from a community that is only 150 large, there's bound to be, at some point, you're going to be related to someone, and so they can't meet the criteria. So one of the things that we instituted was a system of mentorship, education, and accreditation, in order for them to actually take control of their own learning process, incorporate their own practices and cultural history, and then eventually be able to meet some of the standards that were required at a federal level.
Thank you.
All right, so the idea of understanding systems thinking, and a big part of this, and then we're all guilty of it at some point. Again, as humans, we tend to focus, and the more we focus, the more specialized we become in our approach. And to some extent, this is good. This is what actually gets us the specialists in our fields and gets us to the answers. But the problem is, and the adage is always there, sometimes we can't see the forest for the trees. We get so focused on these specifics that we lose sight of the big picture. And without that big picture, we can get off course really quickly. So in order to actually understand the systems thinking, there has to be that big picture that always gets kept in the background, but gives us a reference point as we move forward. Short-term and long-term growth. There has to be the small successes. One of the biggest things that we teach when it comes to change management is you have to celebrate the short-term goals. Without that, you're going to get people who are going to feel like, well, until we actually get to that big goal, are we failing? Are we succeeding? Am I doing a good job? Am I going to get fired halfway through this because I'm not sure if I'm doing this right or not? And so there has to be a real understanding of what the short-term goals are, and celebrate those successes along the way until we get to that big, final stage. Assessing the soft and hard indicators. And it's a tricky one, because people are usually they roll their eyes at that's the soft science, or that's the feel-good aspect of it. But the reality is that we're soft creatures, and as humans, there needs to be the human factor that gets incorporated. And so assessing those soft factors, seeing or understanding or having a full knowledge of how an initiative is being accepted or not accepted. What are people saying? How are they responding to it? Is there a natural or organic response to it, or is there a constant resistance to it? And the hard indicators, and those are the easier ones, because those are the ones that usually come in the form of statistics, in the form of reports. Those are the ones that we look at and see, bottom line, are we moving up or are we moving down? The second to last one is the idea of system versus symptom. And this is where, again, and it always leads back to the idea of positivity versus the negativity. And the idea of a system approach or understanding or always thinking with the idea of a systems, a success story is to say, how is the whole benefiting or suffering in the process? How are we moving forward? When we focus on the symptoms, it's the one aspect or the one element that is actually working against us. And this is always leading back to the idea of building on the change drivers as opposed to focusing on the change resistors. And the other one, and the last one is something that I've always added when I work with executives or when I work with little children, the big thing, and versus or. One of the things that I do when I teach a change management 101 to executives, and the funny thing is that it was developed from a workshop that I did for theater sports with 5-year-olds. And it's a funny thing to say, but children grasp the concept of change almost instinctively. Children understand that change is not like a light switch that we switch on or off. It's not an either-or situation. You'll see a 6-year-old, playing with an iPad and fully fledged into the new technology, into the adult world, and at night goes to bed with his teddy bear and doesn't see anything wrong with it. Adults, we feel like change has to be an either-or system. It cannot be this and that at the same time. Children have this innate capacity to straddle the line of change. They see nothing wrong with being both childish at some points and adult at the same time in separate situations. So as adults, we need to change that sort of mentality, and it certainly is applicable when we deal with organizational change and systematic change, that we need to address it as an and rather than an or. If we say that the change has to be one or the other, you're going to get people who align themselves on one side or the other. And that kind of schism is not what you want in support of any initiative. In order to get that kind of support, you need to say, yes, it can be this, and for a time, it will be this as well. There will be that transition period. We're not on and off kind of creatures. So the idea of sustainability and change, and again, going always back to that whole loop of environmentalism, we need to understand that the idea of greenwashing is not the same thing as developing sustainability methodology. So yes, it's important to have high energy and high energy efficiency processes where I guess we're turning off the lights and we're reducing the paper processes, and all of those things are important, but they are only addressing one of the subsets in the greater picture of sustainability. Understanding the environment and working toward that's important. Same thing with CSR. It's become, the new catchphrase. All corporations have to have their social responsibility strategies in place. And while, again, it is important to have that in place and to work forward to that, it cannot be done in a vacuum. It cannot just be one of the things that we add at the end of the agenda in a meeting on, by the way, we need to do something for the community. There has to be a real understanding that our organization doesn't work in a vacuum. There is the direct impact community that is going to be our greatest asset. They will be our greatest supporters, and they will also be our greatest champions, but only if they are incorporated or they are integrated into the processes that we're trying to move towards. When we start to understand and we start to act within these systems, when we start to integrate the idea of developing the economy, developing our bottom line, which is understandable because without it, how do we stay in business? And at the same time, making it beneficial for that direct impact community. And at the same time, understanding that when we do that, the environment will also benefit from it. That's when we can actually start developing the kind of change strategy that is sustainable. Because if we only address one component, what happens is that when you lose the champion, or when the stress factor hits the wall, then all of a sudden we have no time for that. Let's just focus on keeping ourselves, along and keeping ourselves in the black and not falling into the red. But if understanding that the strategy that we're developing becomes a part of the system, then it's not something that we have to do extraneously. It's not something that we have to just apply ourselves to it when we have time. It becomes part of the integrated process in keeping ourselves in business, in actually developing that profit margin, and at the same time in becoming the kind of socially responsible organization that we're hoping to be. So they can't be done, and this is where we have the idea of integration. So the need for understanding sustainability within a systems process, when we increase the interrelationships, the idea of integration between the environmental, the social, and economic issues, then we actually move ourselves forward and we can actually create that kind of sustainability in a strategy. It becomes a part of the process, and again, as Lyla was saying, well, how do we maintain sustainability? We do it so that we find a way that becomes natural in the process that we do. We don't think about it any longer, it becomes just automatic. And also understanding or developing the idea of the knowledge that there is complexity in environmental and socioeconomic initiatives. It isn't something that can be a one-off. I mean, obviously it can, and there are many organizations that do it, certainly, and there are many consultation services that provide you with how to get your green levels up. But, so it's that one-off thing. But there's a real complexity in getting to that point where you understand that the integrated process or the integrated relationship between your financial development or economic development and the community at large and the environment, they're intrinsically tied. And when we can actually get them all working simultaneously, that's when we actually arrive at that sustainability process. So this is where the idea of understanding your own environment or the culture within your organization, it comes into play. Thinking that you can actually get one person, assign them as team leader, this is going to be the change team, we're going to get on, and then that person is going to get things up and running, and they alone are going to change this, the environment that we're working. It is setting up that poor person up for failure, but it's dooming the initiative to just not succeed. Change is something that if we're going to do it internally as an individual, sure, it just takes me. But even as an individual, if I am trying to change my own behavior, if I'm constantly hanging out with the people that were there in my old behavior, it's going to be very hard for me to actually move forward into that new one. It's no different within an organization. If you want to move that forward, it cannot be that. It cannot be assumed that it'll be one person in one department that's going to get us there into that change. Developing the kind of structure or developing the kind of environment that is going to create change drivers as opposed to change resistors is the next big stage. And that is where you actually start to develop that change management strategy. This is where we say, okay, so how have we been doing business up until now? What is it that we want to get to? What is our goal? What does our success line look like? And then between now and then, that's the gap analysis. Where do we find the resources to get to where we're going so that we can develop that new system? And so that in order to do that, we need to change the structure. We need to change how we open our doors for business every single day. And a big part of this, and I think my next slide will be the idea of the iceberg. Very often, and this goes back to the idea of system versus symptom, is that when there's an iceberg that we fly by and we see the iceberg, this is the idea of just seeing the tip of the iceberg. The greater part of the iceberg is still underwater. And so we don't want to be looking at change with an iceberg mentality. So the idea is that our common daily focus as an organization is to be looking at those day-to-day events. And this is what we say, this is how we're going to change our company, we're going to change these events. Sadly, the biggest part of that process is sitting below that surface or sitting below our day-to-day focus. And then the increased opportunity as we actually start to look down for change and for learning and for leveraging all of your resources sits below that daily focus. We need to look at patterns of behavior. We need to understand operations. How do we function as an organization? How do we function as a government? How do we function as a community? what is our organizational structure? What is the culture that we're working within, and how is it driving change, or how is it impeding it? And the last thing is, and it's funny, you know, if you ask people what is the vision of your company, and they'll usually tell you, oh, it's written down in the front hallway. But rarely do people actually know what the vision of their own organization is. And it's important to know, what is it? What is it that we started out doing? Because if you don't even know what the original vision is, it's going to be really hard to know how much change is going to be required to get to that new success stage. And so, and it's funny that most of these factors, again, sit or they slide below that the day-to-day assessments that we do. So when we focus solely on the events, that's when we start to focus on the symptoms. What are the things that are not working? What are the things that we're doing wrong? Who is just not fitting in? Who is not supporting the initiative? Rather than saying patterns of behavior, or even to say organizational culture, to say, what are we doing that is not supporting this movement as a whole? What are we failing to do for our staff or for our organization to actually help them to propel this initiative forward? So making the transition to sustainability requires a few things, right? So the first thing is changing the way that an organization interacts. It affects its external environment, which has to do with their operations, their impact community, client, the buyers, depending on the organization or the business that you're in. It's those external factors. So, and it's important to understand how we interact with those external factors, because until we know how the interaction takes place, it'll be impossible to actually change the way that we actually do business. And secondly, changing the way the organization interacts with this internal environment. And this leads back to the organizational culture. You know, we've always talked about, you know, since HR became the big buzzword, about how people are our greatest asset. But again, without fully committing to what that says, it's impossible to move forward. And so to really understand, how does our organization interact internally? How does communication, or how does information flow? Is it bidirectional? Is it unidirectional? How much lag time is there between a decision being made and the information being passed on? How much time are we giving people to really react or assess or adapt to the new decisions being made? So there has to be a change in the way that we approach the external factors and the internal factors within our interaction as an organization. So to launch the successful sustainability initiative, we need clarity, clear definitions of goals, clear definitions of success to know exactly where we're going, having a big picture and understanding how our system works so that we know how we interact internally and externally. It's only three small items, but it's amazing how they get muddled up and we forget exactly what it is that we're trying to achieve. The idea of knowing what your success of theory looks like is usually the first step in knowing exactly, because it's easier to recognize it when you see it. You know, I always say, you know, if you're picking somebody up at the airport and you have a picture of who you're picking up, it's a lot easier because when you spot them, you know exactly who they are. If somebody just, you know, tells you you're picking up somebody, you know, this tall and this color hair, it could be any number of people. So the idea of fully understanding, having a clear picture of what the success looks like, gives us a better chance of recognizing it when we're there. So I'll take any questions if you have any, and also to let you know, part of our initiative, or part of our purpose at IIPSM, is to develop the world's, this is our mission, our mission statement, our vision, to establish the world's largest sustainability community of practice. And a community of practice at its most fundamental and meaning, bringing people of various disciplines, various professions, with a commonality and understanding to share information. It's a shame to take all of the social media and all of the technology we have today and not actually share the information. Sometimes the biggest solutions come from the most unexpected places, and this is our vision for the future, is to say there's no reason why information or knowledge has to be hoarded or kept in. Especially that the minute we share it, we actually we learn more, and it just keeps growing. So any questions? I know it's a whole lot. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
You talked about fear being one of the key red flags when you're trying to implement change or execute change. Have you had an instance of dealing with apathy, where the process is similar, the change is similar, but it's just pure apathy that prohibits social change?
It's funny that it's funny that you would bring that up. One of the things that we do is actually we do. When I was speaking about this, the idea of empathetic mapping and actually teaching empathy, apathy tends to be one of our defense mechanisms. And it's a funny thing when you see it in that way, and usually it's manifested. Burnout tends to be one of the biggest contributors to apathy. People get to the point where there is so much, there's that sense of just barely keeping your head above water, and then that one thing, the one drop that overflows the glass, and it's almost a natural sense of defense mechanism to not be affected, because if you don't care, then it isn't going to hurt, right? And so apathy tends to be that defense mechanism, and one of the ways to challenge it or to address it is through that idea of openness and free information. And the biggest thing is, and just recently I had a project where we had to actually walk away because it was the idea, and I don't know if anybody's experienced the nightmare of SAP and ERP implementation, and we were brought in, and when I got there we were developing the strategy, and I realized that their go-live date was 2 weeks away. And and what they really wanted was just some training for the people to to accept this brand new system. And I thought, but how long ago did you send out the information? Have you had some information sharing cafes or some some town hall meetings where you can begin to introduce the idea at the very beginning? And the funny thing is that sometimes the apathy, we always think of it at the front line level. But the funny thing is that very much at the executive level, there's a fear that if I mention this idea too soon, somebody's going to say I don't like it, and before I can even get started, it's going to be dead in the water. Well, the reality is that if you mention it too late, they're still not going to like it, and you're still going to be dead in the water, because without the frontline workers or the frontline people actually supplementing that kind of initiative, it isn't going to happen. And so sharing that information, bringing people in, giving them a sense of ownership to say, you have as much stake here as anybody else, because then we always feel that responsibility that if this is mine, then I have a bigger sense of responsibility in making sure that it succeeds. If it's their idea and if it's their initiative and I'm just here whether I like it or not, then obviously apathy tends to build on that. Yeah. Yes?
They have this business of vision and mission.
Yes.
They're all big words.
Yeah.
Right? And you see them in companies, they have it lying there on the glass table,
Yeah.
they have it stuck up on the wall. It's not a bottom-up function. This is a top-down function.
Yes.
And it never works when it's top-down.
Yes.
It's exactly what you're saying. It has to be bottom-up.
And bidirectional, certainly. But so that and the biggest thing is, and one of the things that we tell the organizations that we work is, differentiate between the mission statement and the vision. The vision should not be 2.5 paragraphs long. If somebody can't say it in one quick line, then they don't know what it is that they are trying to achieve.
Well, much of the time you can't understand what's written on that
That's
piece of
exactly.
paper.
It's true. I'm telling
Then
you,
you
go.
read it again and you wonder, what are they trying to say?
Absolutely, absolutely. And listen, you can even ask some of their executives. We're not just talking about frontline workers. Vision, yep. And then there's no. I'm not sure. Go look down the hallway. It's written on the wall. Yes. The lead tells me. Yes. Oh yes.
Hi. Would you be kind enough to go back to your pyramid there beneath the iceberg? In the organizational culture, you mentioned the question, how is something driving change?
Pardon me?
You mentioned how is something driving change?
Yes. Well, the idea is within the organizational culture, this is where we start to understand the difference between change drivers and change resistors. And the funny thing is that we often tend to think that, again, we always think about the frontline workers as being the ones that are going to be resisting the change. But there are times when we might have policies or procedures in place that are actually preventing your frontline workers from following through in the change. And so you want to make sure that your own organizational culture, the work environment that you are creating, is not actually becoming the change resistor rather than the change driver. Yes?
Thank you. I really agree with your statement that organizations generally wait too late in the game to engage on strategic change. My question goes back to the prior speaker in terms of looking at more disruptive social innovations. And I'm wondering how the theories of change might differ when we don't have distinct roles, we don't have hierarchies necessarily, we don't have systems in place. It's not organizational change. Have we looked at, is there a theory out there that addresses these larger social disruptions?
Do you want to take it or not?
The question is, speaking of change in context of organization, the technology applies to any system basically.
Absolutely, yes.
So,
Yes, and so to answer it at its most basic is that, and this is where the idea of going back to an organic aspect is that these things apply right from the individual onwards. And you're right, very often, and part of the idea of the organizational culture as being an impeding factor rather than a driving factor for change tends to be that structure. The org charts and how it is, the hierarchy works tends sometimes to resist the change rather than drive it. And there are certainly nowadays, and you see it all the time, the communities that are starting to develop that sense of maybe not bringing them down, but certainly buffing down the dividers and the structural change. There's a great book called Disrupt, and I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he worked with Frog Innovators. And one of the big things that they say is that there needs to come a time now where we're just beginning to bring some of this more loose culture into the suit and tie culture. Because if you come into an organization where everyone, the idea, right from the uniform and the suit to everything else that they do, and you tell them, listen, let's pull out the water guns and sit down and relax and have a good day, they're just going to look at you and say, you're a hippie, we can't use you, right? And so part of the idea of change is we want to heat up the metal so that we can bend it. We don't want to break it when we try to snap it in half. And so a big part of this is beginning to show, or when I talk, I always use the word organization because we work with governments, we've worked with communities, actual communities, towns who've said we need some help in actually driving some change here to the corporate culture. The idea is to understand, so do you want to change, and what does the change look like for you? And so when we start to map that out, it becomes inevitable that they start to see, well, we're never going to get where we're going if we keep this the same. Because if we want to look like that, I mean, if we want to look like that, and we keep doing the same thing that we're doing, it isn't going to happen. It's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And it just cannot happen. And so if we want to look differently, then we can't keep doing what we're doing, because if we do what we're doing, we're going to look like we look like right now, not like we want to get to. And that's the idea of mapping out the strategy and taking the baby steps in between. Because it's amazing that, like I said, we always think about the frontline worker as being the biggest resistor, but it is top heavy, and sometimes changing the minds of the people at the top is as, if not more difficult than the people who are actually being swept up in the change. Thank you all very much. Thanks for your time.